Imagine getting dressed every morning without a single button on your shirt, no buttons on your jacket, no buttons on your coat, not even the tiny button holding your sleeves together. Instead, you would need leather straps, ropes, metal pins, or long pieces of cloth just to keep your clothes from falling apart. Today, the buttonhole is so ordinary that almost nobody notices it. Billions of people use one every single day without giving it a second thought. Yet this tiny slit of stitched fabric quietly transformed fashion, warfare, trade, and even social status more than most people realize. The strange part is that for thousands of years, people had buttons, but they didn't have buttonholes. That small difference changed everything. The story doesn't begin in a tailor's workshop or a royal palace. It begins over 5,000 years ago. Long before kingdoms rose across Europe, people living in the ancient civilizations of the Indus Valley, Mesopotamia, and China were already decorating their clothing with beautifully carved buttons made from shells, bone, wood, ivory, and polished stone. These early buttons were often masterpieces of craftsmanship, but they weren't used to fasten clothing. They were jewelry, status symbols, small works of art sewn onto garments to display wealth and skill. If ancient people wanted to keep their clothes together, they relied on something entirely different. Leather belts wrapped around the waist, fabric ties knotted by hand, bone pins pushed through layers of cloth, large bronze brooches that held heavy cloaks across the shoulders. The Romans used elaborate metal fasteners known as fibulae. Vikings favored sturdy brooches designed to survive harsh northern climates. Across Asia, robes were secured with carefully tied cords and sashes. For thousands of years, this system worked well enough. Loose clothing was easier to make. It fit almost anyone. And because garments weren't tightly shaped to the body, there was little need for a precise fastening system. Buttons existed, but they had no real job to do. That may sound surprising today, but for nearly 4,000 years, buttons remained mostly decorative. Fashion simply hadn't evolved to need them. Then, during the High Middle Ages, Europe began to change. Cities grew larger, trade flourished, weaving techniques improved. Tailors became increasingly skilled at cutting fabric to follow the natural shape of the human body instead of hanging loosely from it. Suddenly, clothing was becoming tighter. Sleeves narrowed, doublets hugged the chest, tunics fit around the waist. For the first time in history, people wanted clothing that fit almost like a second skin. But this created a problem. A tight garment is difficult to put on. You couldn't simply pull it over your head. You needed an opening, and once it was on, you needed a way to close it securely. That problem would inspire one of the smallest inventions in human history, and one of the most important, because somewhere in medieval Europe, a tailor made a simple cut in a piece of cloth, then carefully stitched around its edges so it would never tear. It looked almost insignificant, but that tiny reinforced opening would reshape clothing forever. Every movement of the waist, fashion entered a completely new era. Across medieval Europe, fitted doublets, gowns, sleeves, and jackets became symbols of elegance and wealth. Some garments featured dozens of tiny buttons running from the neck to the wrist. Not because every button was necessary, but because every button demonstrated something valuable. Precision, skill, money. Each buttonhole had to be cut by hand, then stitched individually using dense embroidery that prevented the fabric from unraveling. One mistake could ruin an entire garment. Creating a luxurious coat often required hundreds of carefully sewn stitches before a single button was attached. Only master tailors possessed the patience and expertise to produce them. That craftsmanship made buttonholes almost as valuable as the expensive fabrics themselves. Soon, European courts embraced the new fashion. Kings ordered elaborate jackets covered in rows of gleaming metal and jeweled buttons. Nobles competed to wear increasingly sophisticated clothing. Even when many of the buttons served little practical purpose, they sent a clear message. I can afford this. The buttonhole had quietly become a symbol of status. But fashion wasn't the only world transformed by this tiny invention. Soldiers quickly discovered its advantages as well. Before buttonholes, securing armor padding, cloaks, or military garments often required leather straps, knots, or metal pins that loosened during long marches or fierce battles. Button clothing changed that. Uniforms became faster to put on, more secure while moving, easier to repair in the field. Officers could design jackets that fit closely without restricting movement, helping soldiers carry equipment more comfortably over long campaigns. As European armies became larger and more organized, practical clothing became increasingly important. A reliable fastening system may seem insignificant today, but when thousands of soldiers needed uniforms that could withstand rain, mud, horseback riding, and months of marching, even a small improvement mattered. The buttonhole wasn't just making clothing more elegant. It was making it more functional. And as Europe entered an age of exploration, trade, and expanding empires, this tiny stitched opening is about to travel across the world. As European ships crossed oceans and trade-connected continents, the buttonhole traveled with them. Tailors carried their skills from one kingdom to another. Merchants transported buttons made from brass, silver, ivory, wood, and later porcelain. Wherever European fashion spread, the buttonhole followed. By the 16th and 17th centuries, it had become one of the defining features of clothing across much of Europe. But there was still one problem. Every single buttonhole was made by hand. A skilled tailor would first mark its position with remarkable precision. Then came the most dangerous step. A small slit was carefully cut into the fabric. Cut too short, and the button would never fit. Cut too long, and the entire garment could begin to tear. The edges were then wrapped in dozens of tightly packed stitches, each one locking the threads together to prevent fraying. A single well-made buttonhole could take several minutes to complete. Now imagine a military coat with 50 buttons, or a nobleman's jacket with 100. Some garments required hours of work devoted to buttonholes alone. It wasn't just sewing, it was craftsmanship. This is why finely tailored clothing remained a luxury for centuries. The true cost wasn't always the fabric, it was the labor. Then came a revolution that changed almost everything. The Industrial Revolution. Steam engines transformed factories. Textile mills produced cloth faster than ever before. Sewing machines dramatically increased the speed of garment production. Yet one task stubbornly resisted automation. Early sewing machines could stitch long, straight seams with incredible speed, but creating a reinforced opening was far more complicated. Manufacturers spent decades trying to solve the problem. Finally, during the late 19th century, specialized buttonhole sewing machines began appearing in factories. What once took several minutes by hand could now be completed in seconds. It was a breakthrough as important for clothing as the assembly line would later become for automobiles. Suddenly, well-made shirts, jackets, uniforms, and coats no longer belonged only to the wealthy. Ordinary workers could afford clothing that fit better, lasted longer, and looked more refined than anything their grandparents had owned. The buttonhole had quietly become one of the engines of ready-made fashion. But perhaps its greatest influence is something most people have never questioned. Look at your shirt. If you're wearing a men's shirt, the buttons are probably on the right. If it's a women's blouse, they're usually on the left. No one knows with complete certainty. One popular explanation points to Europe's wealthy families. Centuries ago, aristocratic women were often dressed by servants. Since most servants were right-handed, placing buttons on the left side made fastening someone else's clothing easier. Men, meanwhile, usually dressed themselves. Right-side buttons felt more natural for a right-handed wearer. Another theory suggests military practicality. Most soldiers carried swords on their left side. Jackets that overlapped in a particular direction helped prevent wind from catching the fabric and made drawing a weapon slightly easier. Historians continue to debate the true reason, but one thing is certain. The buttonhole became so successful that even its smallest design choices survived for hundreds of years. Today, automated machines produce thousands of perfect buttonholes every hour. Lasers inspect their quality. Computer-controlled sewing heads position every stitch with microscopic precision. And yet, the basic idea hasn't changed. A reinforced slit designed to hold a button securely. The same principle medieval tailors perfected more than 7 centuries ago. Think about how many times you've buttoned a shirt without noticing it. How many jackets you have closed. How many coats, uniforms, jeans, or cuffs you've worn. Every one of them depends on a simple invention that most of us never think about. Unlike the steam engine, the printing press, or electricity, The buttonhole never changed the world with noise or spectacle. It changed the world quietly, one stitch at a time, one garment at a time, one person at a time. Sometimes history isn't shaped by the biggest inventions. Sometimes it's shaped by the smallest hole in a piece of cloth. The world around us is filled with forgotten inventions hiding in plain sight. A buttonhole, a zipper, a spoon, a pencil, objects so familiar that we stop asking where they came from. But every one of them has a story of human ingenuity, ambition, and centuries of innovation. Here we uncover those stories, one ordinary object at a time. So if you enjoy thoughtful documentaries that reveal the hidden history behind the everyday things we often take for granted, consider subscribing, because the next time you look at something ordinary, you might just see history instead. Thanks for watching.